Help me welcome Preston Zeller. He is the founder of Psalmlog, an AI-powered biblical guidance app that helps believers access scripture-based wisdom for real-life challenges. He now pioneers responsible AI integration in ministry, a space where 57% of Christians express skepticism about technology. Preston is also an award-winning documentary filmmaker. His film, The Art of Grieving, chronicles his year of painting 365 works following his brother's sudden death from a fentanyl overdose. The film has reached audiences in 40 plus countries, used in educational curriculum, available in international libraries, and has won multiple festivals. Preston.
Stephanie, it's a pleasure to be here with you. Blessing. Thank you for having me on here to chat with you.
Absolutely. And we look forward to hearing more about your story. I loved how you are bridging the gap and helping AI serve faith well, but you also recognize where it falls short. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, AI is, like you mentioned that stat, and that's from a research study that we had done, but it's AI is an umbrella of technology first and foremost. I think people need to understand that it's not just ChatGPT or one of these kinds of tools. I mean, they helped it go mainstream, but I think AI is a tool that God has allowed to be created, just like anything out there. I've gone back to the Gutenberg press a lot lately because that was a revolutionary tool,
Sure was.
to
Mhm.
and so internet, TV, radio, all these forms of communication that have really helped excel the Great Commission effort that we're all called to do as believers. And I've asked myself for a long time, because I've been sitting at this intersection of technology, but also I have my faith like in the background there, and I'm navigating working corporate jobs in the secular world. And I'm going, God, there's some bigger purpose here. I know. I just don't understand what that is yet. And so
Mhm.
finally last January, I'd been doing a lot with AI in a more like bleeding edge kind of way, and this notion of AI being helpful and impactful in journaling came up. And that's what Psalmlog started as, and it's evolved a lot from there into more just the ability to address the variety of different issues that people may have in their normal walk, and also realizing that that's a very big problem actually that people struggle with is going, I know the Bible has answers, I don't know where to go, or I have a devotional book, but that didn't speak to me today. And so we have this technology that can actually de facto take your own situation and help you understand that in the context of scripture. So conceptually that's there. Now, how does that done? Well, there's, a whole process that I'm continually iterating on to improve those kind of results. But again, doing it in this ethical way and knowing that people are going to ChatGPT, especially younger generations, and they're going, hey, here's my problem, help
Mhm.
me figure it out. And that none of those platforms are innately designed with a certain theology in mind that I could tell, it's going to kind of give you a preconceived bias. So that's kind of the mission, the road I've been sent down, and it's a very difficult one to figure out. It's not some cushy problem or a benign problem that is just like, it's not really going to ruffle any feathers. I'm okay with that. I mean, that's just part of it's part of the journey. But again, I think people need to know it's a tool just like anything else, and ultimately what people do with it, they got to be accountable to God for that.
That's right. I agree. I agree. I mean, we can use most tools, right? And
Mm.
choose to use them in a way that honors God, you know.
Yeah.
And so this is another such tool. And you have even stated that it's never intended to replace pastoral care. That
Uh-uh.
has its own specific role and purpose. And obviously, we're not advocating that people only turn to these tools, but
No.
within their toolkit to have that and to use it in a way that would help them is definitely something that's worth considering. And as you said, it's not going away. It's here. This is a thing that we all have in our world now, in our back pocket, in our hand.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and I think there's something, people, if this is a foreign concept to you, I'll explain it. But basically, we're increasingly more connected online, but also isolated in many ways.
Yes.
We were talking about kind of homeschooling and family rearing and stuff before this, and it's like raising a family used to be a communal effort. and if you're blessed enough to be plugged into a good community through your church or whatever, then you're going to have that. But even then, that is not the same as what it was, I believe, years ago when we didn't have kind of suburbia and that notion. And so because of that, it's maybe not quite the same as like, oh, let me just walk, next door and go talk to my fellow believer about this thing I'm going through. They have the time of day. We're busier, more inundated with information. It's just a very different pace of life. And not to mention, if you look at like chaplaincy or pastors at your church or that kind of thing, they're taking on the oftentimes heaviest of issues that are going on. And there's only so much that person can, right? The ability to bear each other's burdens wasn't meant to be isolated to a select few. In an ideal space, we could do that equally amongst each other. That's not the reality we live in. So this is, like you said, it's not a replacement for anything. It is filling a gap that may not have been otherwise able to be filled in the way that it can today. And that is, you need that quick answer. You need the ability to reflect and do it in a moment's notice because it is wearing at you. And also one of the other goals of the app is actually to pull people out of isolation. And you could be isolated because you're around a group of people who you're changing your views and they may not be amenable to that, or you're actually physically isolated and not real confident in going into like a public social setting right away. And so this isn't implemented yet, but part of the intent is to get people back in a community by recommending certain groups like Grief Share or Celebrate Recovery.
So more almost seeing it as like a bridge back to community. That's a really good perspective. I like that too. Because someone in the middle of the night, they're awake and they're in distress and they may not have someone that they know yet to call on. As you just described, they're in groups of people where they don't feel like they can turn to or don't have access to a pastor yet. So yes, for them to be able to just simply type in and find out some information that would address their particular issue, that could be a really beautiful gift.
Yeah, and I'll throw out a situation out there that I think probably every human has dealt with, and that is you're awake ruminating about some person in your life who you feel like is wronged you. And it might be your spouse, or it could be work thing, it could be just it could be a stranger, whatever it is. But I think we've all been there where you're like, man, the things I would have said, why is this, affecting me so bad? I had someone use the app who actually went through a friendship breakup and used the app to help actually process it because their inclination was a lot more bitterness than, what it should have been. So anyways, that's some insight there.
Yeah. So just a different way it can be used for sure. Well, I know you have obviously come to this place of creating and recognizing the need and then creating something to help people, but you have gone through a significant loss yourself. And the way that you dealt with that and processed through that, I recognize as a coach, I also have a brain health certification. And so people who are in a fight or flight or freeze situation, the first thing to go is often their creativity. And it's hard to get that back. And I was really amazed, inspired by the idea that that was yet the very thing that you use. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. And, I underestimated how many people with what you just brought up, like they do lose that. I learned more about it, actually, a licensed art therapist which if people don't know, art therapists have to go through more training than a traditional psychologist does because they have to get trained in that and then they have to go get certified in art therapy. But I've been creative my whole life, visual arts, been a musician for a very long time. So I just inherently knew, I turned to creativity and particularly lyric writing, music writing in high school, which is like kind of the most tumultuous transformation that we go through, or one of the most severe ones when we're growing up. So I knew that this was a good way to kind of express the things that I was feeling. And So when my brother passed, this was 7 years ago now, I saw it as an opportunity to use my artistic skill set, and I was doing a lot of painting at the time to explore that. But what was interesting in there is that I love doing big pieces. So maybe like 3 or 4 feet on each side, that kind of thing, up to like 6 feet. But they're not small. So you got to put more time and orchestration into it. So I was doing those, but those take time. They take up space. You know, most artists aren't like selling every piece they have. So I figured that, man, I need to work through this in a quicker way, but also realize that the art I was creating through an art show I had and other experiences was getting other people to open up about their own grief. And it just, all of these things kind of hit me where, okay, well, someone who's maybe doesn't think of themselves as creative can look at a creative work and then reflect on their own grief, and an abstract creative work, no less, which was threw in a whole nother interesting element to it. But then for me, I created the Art of Grieving project really because it was like I could rapidly work through and daily work through the things I was feeling, because I also was doing these paintings in what you would call an intuitive abstract manner. So I'm not having these expectations of I need to sell this thing or it's for a client or whatever. It's like, hey, I'm just feeling what I'm feeling. I'm grabbing colors and paints and tools that strike me at the time, and I'm just painting, and I'll paint until I'm done. Could be 5 minutes, could be 30 minutes, could be an hour, and then that's it. and then I'll go about my day.
Mhm.
So
Well, I would say that probably that idea of doing it in an intuitive way was probably a really big part of the healing, because a lot of people, when they're grieving, they push that down and they don't
yeah,
acknowledge it. So you recognizing it and then using it in a constructive manner, I'm sure was very beneficial to healing.
yeah, and there was definite a roller coaster in there. Like I could look at, in fact, okay, so I had in front of my desk in my office, I had 3 rows of 10, so 30 days, and I would swap out the oldest painting on there for the most recent painting. So I had this like rolling 30 days of paintings sitting in
Mhm.
front of me, and I would use that to actually sit back and reflect on the last 30
Yeah.
days.
Mhm.
And it was trippy how I could tell changes and breakthroughs I was having, from breaking out of a cycle of anger to being more at peace to feeling more times of like that to sadness. I mean, just all those different primary emotions. I mean, I think the thing about grief that's tricky is you're feeling a lot of things at one time
Yes.
versus just, some dominant emotion. So yeah, the ability to reflect on it, and it actually introduced me to a modality of journaling that I had never really considered. I mean, in many ways, that was a precursor to what Psalmlog is, although a lot of my artistic pursuits have been. But every time you're expressing yourself creatively, there's some part of you that you're getting to understand better versus, like you said, shoving it down, which is the instinct. I'm just going to store this somewhere and hope, you know, bury it in a field and never have to return to it. And you're like, no, you're stuffing into a pressure cooker
Exactly. Yeah,
that is eventually going to blow up. And
that's
if
right.
when it does, that's not good.
Yeah. And that's what our brain wants to do rather than, feel the hard feelings. It wants to push them down, tuck them away, hide them under a rug, and not really face them. But by doing it,
Mhm.
that's really where the healing is. It's not the easy way, but for the long haul, I believe it is, because then it doesn't have to resurface again later, often in a more damaging or more difficult way when we wait. And it becomes, as you just described, a pressure cooker kind of an experience. Yeah, I'm interested whenever you talked about the modality of journaling, like this was kind of your mode or modality there. And that is one of the things I do with all of my clients is I ask them to journal as a means
Mhm.
of expression. And there's usually some resistance to it. It's like, oh
Mhm.
no, I don't want to do that. I'm not
Mhm.
comfortable with that. And once they do, without fail, every client that has finally broken through the resistance and done it, they have expressed how helpful it was. And I'm
Mhm.
sure that's what you've experienced as you're, talking about here, being able to be in tune with where you were and even recognizing the emotions you were processing through. That's resonating. And I'm sure the listeners are just, soaking this in And I hope it's very beneficial. I believe it will be for them. I had a thought as you were describing your painting, and
Mhm.
I'm just going to ask you this. We didn't talk about this ahead of time, but did you notice association with color to the different emotions?
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up. So part of my background is actually in like branding, and in branding, you use color theory.
Hmm.
Um, and I initially tried to apply that to my painting, and that's not really the way it works in the sense that like we talk Lindsay Letterman in the documentary talks about this, but she's like, you could see red and see passion, love, those kinds of things. I could see
Hmm.
it and see anger and
Hmm.
rage.
Hmm.
So I asked her later on. I met Lindsay kind of three-quarters of the way through doing the documentary, and I wanted to give her all my paintings and be like, "Hey, can you psychoanalyze all these for me?" She's like, "No, that's not the way it works. They actually have to do it really in the moment while
Hmm.
you're expressing these things, or like very shortly after you making these, because it's fresh and it has to be like kind of coaxed out of you.
Hmm.
But of course, my process wasn't like formal art therapy. It was just my own sort of program I put together, if you will. But yes, to answer your question, I did associate certain times with certain kinds of colors. I don't really go back necessarily and be like, oh man, this blue one, I remember that day.
Hmm.
It's just I know there was a point in which like I started gravitating towards green a lot. That was really interesting, and part of that I kind of associated with the fact my brother was in the military. I love nature. I don't really fully know. I just know that I started using certain colors, and so when I did bigger paintings later on, I'm like my color palette shifted a lot. It was actually more vibrant in many ways than maybe even before that, and certainly the first paintings I did after his death. And the last thing I'll say there is I I found a program that was a, hopefully say this right, spectroscopy analysis program. I think that's the right word for it. But basically, whatever you look at under a microscope, it was meant to do image analysis for images you take under a microscope. But it had all this color analysis stuff in there. And there's a very short clip in the documentary where I started to do all this crazy mapping of the colors in like quadrants and on a timeline, because there were dates associated with each file that I had scanned, and I made sure those were all right. And that was pretty cool to see. I think it's called Image J. It's a really
Hmm.
old program. But
Okay.
that was really cool to see. There was nothing that came out of that that made me necessarily go, there's like this hidden code in here.
Yeah.
But I will say this, and especially for those who like are curious, how this documentary kind of culminates. The goal was always with doing these paintings to rearrange them into a whole separate image, a mosaic, which is what it ended up as, that to me felt like what it meant to move through grief. And that when you see the final image, that'll totally make sense. And for me, really hit the nail on the head in the end, because it truly does feel like this summation of especially those early days of grieving. And there's this black box in the center that's like whatever starts your grief, but it's very small relative to all the color around it, which is really like the whole growing around your grief. So, anyways, I said a
Yeah.
lot about color, but
Oh, that's good. I appreciate that. I'm sure that's resonating with a lot of listeners. And, we are going to make sure that we include the links in the show notes that you can
yeah.
go and see this documentary and any of the other things that he offers right now, the Psalmlog, et cetera. Make sure, and you can reach out to him as well just to connect with him. So make sure you look at the show notes for all of those details. But I appreciate what you're sharing. I think it is going to help definitely spread some hope for our listeners. And I think it's been really interesting, this component with how you have used the creative element to work through, as you said, you're moving through grief. And I think that's a really good phrase to think on, because a lot of times what we hear people say, and we even feel it ourselves, you feel stuck in
Hmm.
whatever the emotion is, particularly grief or other things, overwhelm, etc. And I think recognizing that God gives us the ability to move through those emotions, and whatever
Mm.
healthy means that we use to do that, as you've expressed several here, I think it's important that we use those. And I think that's what I'm getting out of our conversation, is just to encourage people that you're not stuck. you do have options available to you and people around you that can support you if you're not involved, with a supportive group or in a church setting. That is highly recommended. But I appreciate what you're sharing. And I do think that I want to give you the time to share anything else that you would want to share with us. I know one thing we touched on was how you've turned tragedy into purpose. And I just think that is so good for people to hear what comes after, what there is something after. So can you share a little bit with us?
Yeah, I think it's important for people to know too that the God gives us these tools to be able to work through it physically here, right? But then it's also, of course, ultimately like really submission to God
Yeah.
in these different things that we have and putting it on the back of Jesus.
Mhm. Mhm.
But part of the reason why I made the documentary, there's two things. One is realizing how really terrible we are culturally at talking about grief.
Mm.
And so you feel, I don't know, you feel loony because you're like, wow, this is so hard. How do I navigate this? Nobody gets me. Nobody wants to deal with my problems. And I used to blame people in that. I'll tell you, after my brother died, I have 13 cousins. I heard from like one, and we all grew up together. And I was shocked at that. But also, they don't get it. I can't say I would have been any different. And so I think there's a tendency to feel alone. So grief, we're just kind of disconnected it from as society and even the end of life process in many ways. So this documentary was meant to open up that conversation, which is why we partially go into history in the documentary to talk about that. But then, like you said, creativity is one of the first things to go, which is really unfortunate. But also what I've heard and seen firsthand is people go, I never thought about using creativity, in a particular painting, to understand myself better. And they go do it. They go buy paints. I'm like, that's amazing. Amazing that it's just showed people the potential there. And I'm not making any Picasso or whatever in this documentary, which is also part of the point because most artists filter their best work. And great if you want to do that. I kind of intentionally wanted to buck that, mentality by saying, hey, here's a ton of work. And I'll tell you, there were a lot of pieces, actually, oddly enough, that I was like, this is stupid. Like, I didn't know what it was at the end, but I'm like, I'm done with this. And someone would go on and buy prints of it later. so yeah, that surprised me. So anyways, just don't judge the thing that you are creating through your grief, and know that it's for a much better and bigger purpose than any commercialization, not or that anyone needs to see it. It's for you to just let out those emotions. And that's, I think, what you're effectively doing. Again, Lindsay has a very articulate way of describing this in the documentary of the healthy psychological effects of being creative. And so I'd encourage you to watch it from that standpoint as well. Yeah. Anyways.
Oh, that's really good. And I think this is great wisdom for all of us. We all go through things, whether it's as deep of a loss like what you've experienced, or even just little small things throughout the day that can kind of be something that we have to work through. You hear it talked about as little T trauma, big T trauma, but regardless, if your body's having trouble processing something, then it is considered trauma to you. And grabbing onto some of these tools, taking some of what Preston has shared with us today, tapping into some of the tools that he's offering, is definitely a great idea for us. Well, I really appreciate what you're sharing. And you just reminded me something that I was going to ask you about, and that is the history part. That history element is so important. I don't want us to close out without revisiting that briefly. If you don't mind, can you tell us a little bit more about the history and how throughout history we've been able to use art in a therapeutic way?
Yeah. Well, I boiled it down into kind of three categories. One was ceremonial artwork. So it was basically you're culturally creating art out of response to grief. There's three categories. I think one was just like commentative art,
Okay.
kind of like death related artwork. So people maybe exploring the crucifixion of Christ, right? But then there's another one that I just categorize as like grief art in general,
Okay.
which is more like an intentional pivot in someone's creative process to address
Mm,
what they're going through.
okay.
Um, and and there was a number of different mediums that I covered in it. Like there's the gisants, which were these like reclined marble carvings that you would see in, I think, France or medieval time periods. And then there's wood carvings. There's a tribe in Africa that I talked about there. Writing, for sure. Cicero, talked about Job a bit. And then some different paintings. There's a lot that come up on the screen that I'm not necessarily like talking about that painting, but it's kind of a montage of works. And I think Edvard Munch, he did the Scream
Mhm.
uh, painting that we're all really familiar with. But he did a series of paintings and drawings on his, I think it was sister who died from tuberculosis.
Okay.
And you could see he did a number of iterations, but it's also where he developed his like, unique style. So that was kind of interesting. But all that to be said, you go all the way back as far back as like the Egyptian Book of the Dead, because that has a lot of illustrations in it.
Mm.
And whatever someone may think of the Book of the Dead, it's like there's some amount of illustration and painting and all that kind of stuff. There's an encaustic painting technique that I talked about as well in there, that an encaustic is using wax, dyed wax. It's very prevalent across cultures. And you go, okay, well, this isn't a novel thing that I would be doing this. And then I basically go way back in time and then kind of work up to now, because there's another aspect of it that I think her name's Candy Chang. Yes, Candy Chang.
Okay.
She has this huge mural that is kind of a death positive movement, and I sort of summed it up by saying I think we need to have a grief positive movement, and that doesn't negate what she said. It's just going, hey, there grief is going to happen, and it presents a tremendous opportunity to grow.
Mm.
And so, by how you view that, right? If it's just this like, oh, it's an obstacle and I'm going to deal with it and I'm going to get over it and I'm going to go back to work and work myself to death to, you know, pretend like this didn't happen. Like, no, you're going to change, like inevitably, whether it's forced on you or whether you let it have that gradual change. So I think all that to be said, it's very evident that artists have covered death and grief more than we probably pay attention to or realize, and that's kind of reassuring that this is a normal thing for people to navigate. And it doesn't have to be some museum piece. And also realize that some of the things that we may view as like, oh, a famous piece now, from a famous artist, they weren't famous at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I think Van Gogh is kind of an example of that. But they're getting something out of it. Van Gogh is an example, but also kind of a weird one because he committed suicide. But he was definitely using artwork to work through grief. So
Mm-hmm.
I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, that is very helpful. It's very helpful. As you said, your whole documentary is the point of opening up the whole conversation around grief, and we all know that we experience it, but that having the conversation and looking for healthy ways to work through it, not feeling like you're stuck in it or that you're alone, all of those
Mm.
things are really important reminders. So I appreciate you bringing all that to the light, and we will be sure to include all the ways that you can reach out to Preston in the show notes. And I appreciate you coming and sharing with us today. Thank you so much, Preston.
Cool. Thanks, Stephanie. Appreciate you having me on.
If you're listening to this and you're realizing that you would like to work through some of those emotions that maybe you've pushed down or tucked under the rug, reach out in the show notes that can help you step into the beautiful life that God has given us. This is your invitation to come and join us in the Hope Collective, where we work on all things that help us to become the very best version of ourselves. If it means processing through emotions, praying for one another, taking our thoughts captive so they don't take us captive, and using the resources and the fellowship around us to become the very best version of ourselves as we step into the beautiful life that God has given us. So come join us in the Hope Collective. You can use the show notes below to connect.